Hello, in this video we are going to be looking once again at Immanuel Kant, but in this case in a bit more detail in terms of the technical side of his moral philosophy. This will involve looking at his notion of the good will, maxims, and hypothetical and categorical imperatives. And it is essential that you know all of these terms, what they mean, and how they work in relation to Kant's moral philosophy for the AQA spec. So, as I've said, in this video we'll be looking at the good will, which is a species of practical reason. We'll be looking at maxims. We'll be looking at the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. And actually in the next video after this one, we'll be looking at contradiction in concept, contradiction in will, and perfect and imperfect duties. So let's begin with the good will. All right? Now the good will, it is important to realise, does not refer to wishes, desires, and so on. Okay? And you'll see why in a moment. All right? So normally when people say, oh, I acted out of goodwill, what they mean is that I acted on the desire to do something nice for you or something like that. But Kant doesn't mean the goodwill in this sense. Right? So it doesn't refer to wishes, desires, and so on. It's much more a form of practical reasoning. All right? So it's a form of practical reasoning that we use when determining our moral laws or what our duties are. Okay? And Kant doesn't believe that the human will is always good. Hence the distinction between the will and the goodwill. Sometimes, for example, we use practical reason for our own ends, for selfish reasons. When, for example, we act in accordance with duty and not for the sake of it. All right, so if you remember Kant's example of the shopkeeper, one of whom doesn't overcharge his customers because he believes it's his duty not to, and the other one who doesn't overcharge his customers because he wants to keep them. In the latter case, all right, although the shopkeeper acts in the same way as the other shopkeeper who acts from duty, right, he's just acting in accordance with duty and not for the sake of it, and he's acting because of selfish motives. All right, so the shopkeeper who acts only in accordance with duty is using his will. He's not using the goodwill. All right. Reason is required to determine a moral law, which is why the goodwill is a form of practical reason. So you need to be able to firstly understand whether or not your maxim or your action guiding principle can be universalized. Right? In other words, whether it could be applied to everyone. And how one would go about actually putting that into practice. All right. So the reason is required to determine a moral law, which is why the goodwill is a form of practical reason. And in the groundwork, which is where Kant sets out his moral philosophy, since reason is required for the derivation of actions from laws, the will is nothing other than a species of practical reason. And the goodwill is practical reason that is answerable to the categorical imperative, which we'll come to in a moment. So, as I said just now, an example of the goodwill would be if the shopkeeper reasons that it is his duty not to overcharge his customers. Right? He would reason that, among other things, the concept of value in relation to people's needs would collapse, and as such, he would understand that as wrong. This would go for never break a promise as well. Right? So, for example, if I wanted to do something and it involved me breaking a promise to my friend, then according to Kant, I have to think about what would happen if everyone decided to break promises under those kinds of circumstances, and if they did, what would happen? And of course, one of the things that Kant points out is that the concept of promise would almost certainly collapse, alongside the fact that I'm actually asking for other people to break their promises to me. All right, so there are two forms of contradiction there, and that's again something we'll be looking at in a subsequent video. Kant makes a further and very important distinction that you need to know about. and that is between reason and inclinations. Right? Now, inclinations are broadly speaking emotions. All right? And one of the things that Kant observes is that we do not act for the sake of duty, but fall prey to inclinations. Right? That's frequently what happens when we go against what the morally right thing to do happens to be. All right? So frequently we do not act for the sake of duty, but fall prey to some inclination or some emotion. All right? So we let our own desires get in the way of what is morally right. Given that we're prone to use practical reason for our own ends, because we've fallen prey to our emotions or our inclinations, Kant believes that we as human beings are not in complete conformity with reason. We are susceptible to incentives that conflict with reason. We're susceptible to emotion, right? So instead of acting reasonably in response to someone, we might want revenge. Okay, it's emotion overriding reason. All right, and when this happens, Kant says we find it impossible to act morally. So, it is only if we use practical reason in accordance with the demands of pure reason that we will be able to act morally. All right, we can still use practical reason when we've fallen prey to our emotions. All right, but reason doesn't run all the way through our motives. All right, it only runs as far as trying to figure out what it is that we need to get what we want. All right, so this is why Kant dismisses the role of emotion or inclination in coming to understand our moral obligations. And indeed, Kant observes that our emotions are unreliable. All right, so we might have a particular feeling in relation to one circumstance at one point, and then in pretty much the same circumstance later on, we might have a different feeling. Emotions are transient. They come and go, and you can't guarantee that they will be the same tomorrow as they were today. So we get to this idea of the moral law. Right? And the moral law holds for all rational beings. Right? So any being that has the capability to be rational is answerable to the moral law. And it is derived from the application of pure reason. In other words, if you have the ability to apply reason, you are therefore answerable to the moral law. Animals are not answerable to the moral law because they are unable to reason, or at least reason to the point where they could be understood as rational. Okay, so animals are unable to entertain concepts such as promise, let alone why it should be our moral duty to keep them. So they can't think about, for example, the concept of a promise collapsing if everyone broke promises. But rationality allows human beings not only to understand the concept of a promise, but also why we ought to keep our promises. All right? So a rational being could not logically live in a way that was devoid of such concepts. All right? So it's part of being a rational being that we do keep promises, that there is such a thing as truth, that it is wrong to lie, because if lying occurred all of the time, the concept of truth would collapse, and of course then you're willing that other people lie to you. Okay, so this is why rational beings are necessarily moral beings, answerable to a moral law that is derived from reason. Maxims. Now, I've referred to maxims a few times already, but this is where we're going to really sort of pick apart what they are. A maxim is essentially an action guiding principle, right? So it's a principle on which an action is based. And according to Kant, at least, when it is first thought of, it is subjective. If it conforms to the universal law through the good will, then it becomes objective. And I'll cash that out, what that means, in a moment. But let's just think about this idea of maxims in a little bit more detail and give you a couple of examples. All right? So if I said, never break a promise, that is a maxim. It's an action guiding principle. It is telling you that you should not do something. Similarly, if I said, always give to charity, that is an action guiding principle. It's a maxim. All right. Now, at that point, you don't know whether either or both of those maxims are moral or not. All right. And it's only when we begin to unpack them in relation to Kant's categorical imperative that we can understand whether or not they are moral maxims or non-moral maxims or immoral maxims, perhaps. All right. And it's also true that not all maxims are therefore moral maxims. All right. And Kant gives an example of a maxim: when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know this will never happen. All right. So that's an action guiding principle, but it is one that involves breaking a promise. All right. And we've already looked at that a little bit. Now, maxims can be divided into two kinds of principle: hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. The example that we've just looked at in terms of borrowing money, saying you're going to pay it back with no intention of doing so, this is a hypothetical imperative because it is a means to an end imperative, right? I want money, therefore I ask to borrow it to get it, right? But then and I promise to pay it back, but I have no intention of so doing. So it's a way. A hypothetical imperative is a means to end imperative. It's a way of getting something, and in order to get it, I have to do something else. All right. So perhaps a more simplistic way of looking at it would be: if I wanted to get some chocolate, I might need to go to the shops. So the end would be the obtaining of chocolate, and the means would be the going to the shop to get it. Again, with Kant's money example, the end would be the acquisition of money, and the means would be asking to borrow it with no intention of paying it back. All right, so that's a hypothetical imperative. It's a means to end imperative. All right. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, are imperatives that are not of the means end variety. Right? They are just ends. And I'll explain all that in more detail in a moment. Just to give you a quote here from Kant: all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. The former represents the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wills, or it is at least possible for one to will. The categorical imperative would be that which represented an action as objectively necessary of itself without reference to another end. In other words, the categorical imperative does not rely on any means for its realization. All right. So as I've said, hypothetical imperatives are those of means to ends. They are still connected with our ability to reason, but they are not moral imperatives. There may be moral issues at stake, but because they are means to ends principles, any act that they give rise to will not be done for the sake of duty. It'll be done for some other reason. Rather like the shopkeeper who acts in accordance with duty but not for the sake of duty. Remember, the shopkeeper acts in accordance with duty because he wants to keep his customers. So you can see it's a means to ends transaction. The end is wanting to keep his customers, and the means is not overcharging them. So here are some examples. Whenever queuing for a ticket would make me miss my train, I'd jump the queue. All right? Can this be universalized? All right? What would happen if everyone did that? All right? Again, never break a promise. What would happen if everyone never broke promises? All right? Is that something that could be universalized? Could everyone do it? Which one is hypothetical and which one is categorical? Well, the top one is hypothetical. Whenever queuing for a ticket would make me miss my train, I jump the queue. All right? It's a means to end idea. Okay? Whereas never break a promise is categorical. There is no means to end transaction going on there at all. Now to categorical imperatives. All right? A categorical imperative expresses a single formal idea. All right? that of a rational being acting wholly in accordance with the demands of reason. All right? In the case of human beings who have less than completely rational will, this means repressing your emotions and yielding wholly to the demands of reason. In other words, any kind of emotional response you might have has to be completely sidelined and play no part in your moral decision making. All right. Now, a wholly rational being would be one without emotion, so there would be no need to bend the will in such a way that it would be in accordance with reason. It would just occur naturally, or so Kant believes. Okay, and I suppose it would if you didn't have any emotion. And this is something actually that you might well want to come back to when thinking about some objections to the Kantian approach. Right? Kant does not allow for any kind of emotional input in moral decision making. So one way to understand the categorical imperative is to think about the distinction between ought and can. Right? There's no point in saying that you ought to do something if it's one's duty to do it, if there is no way that it can be done. Right? Because that would just be unfair. I can't say to you, you ought to do something if there's no possible way in which you could do it. All right? So that's just something else to consider in relation to the categorical imperative. If you ought to do something, then it implies can. All right? If you can't do it, then there's no sense in saying that you ought to do it. So this is ultimately now Kant's most famous statement, and it is the most famous formulation of the categorical imperative. There are several, and we'll look at 3 later on. Okay, and it is a form of algorithm, if you like, that is intended to help you and show you what are moral maxims and what are not moral maxims, or what are not perhaps immoral maxims. And it is known as the categorical imperative because it is the formula. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, act only according to that action guiding principle where you can at the same time will that everyone should do it. All right? So that's a sort of way of translating it. So I'm going to finish this video here. All right. Hopefully this has given you a good idea of the difference between hypothetical and categorical imperatives and moral maxims. And in the next video we are going to look at Kant and moral contradictions.